I don't know how long I've got before the lights flicker again, but if you're hearing this, you need to listen closely because I don't think you'd believe me if I just said it straight out. I work the night shift at a Dollar General in rural Louisiana, and there are rules, strange rules, that you have to follow if you want to survive here. I didn't believe them when I first got the job, thought it was just local superstition or some kind of hazing ritual for new hires. But then the first night, I heard something scratching under the floorboards when the store was supposed to be empty, and then I saw, God help me, I saw a face staring at me through the freezer door glass, but it wasn't my reflection. Its eyes were open too wide, like they'd been painted on, and its smile was pressed against the glass as if the thing was on the inside. You need to understand, this place is not just a store, not at night. There are things that move when you're not looking, voices that whisper through the aisles when the air conditioning clicks off. And if you make one wrong move, if you break one single rule, the store won't let you leave when morning comes. And last night, one of the rules got broken. I didn't think I'd end up here. Not in this swamp-cut, backwater stretch of Louisiana where the air itself feels heavy with secrets. But life has a way of pushing you places you don't plan on going. I had lost my job 2 towns over. Bills were piling up, and my old Chevy was coughing out its last breaths when I saw the help wanted night shift sign duct taped to the inside window of this Dollar General. It was the kind of store that felt more like an afterthought than a business, sitting at the end of a gravel pull-off off Highway 71, its neon letters half dead, buzzing against a sky that always seemed bruised even when the sun was shining. I walked in that day just to ask about hours, thinking I'd run a register, stock some shelves, sweep up the mess. I wasn't expecting the manager, a thin man with skin the color of candle wax and a smile that didn't fit his eyes, to slide a folded sheet of paper across the counter and tell me flatly, "If you can follow these rules, you can have the job." I laughed at first, thought it was a joke, but his smile never wavered, and he told me not to read them yet, not until I got through my first night. That should have been my first warning sign, but desperation makes you blind, and so I nodded, took the key to the back door, and told him I'd be in at 10 the first night on shift. I tried to shake off the unease by telling myself it was just another job. The air outside was damp, the cicadas screaming in the trees like an alarm no one ever shuts off, and the parking lot sat cracked and uneven, weeds growing tall out of the pavement like they were trying to reclaim it. The inside smelled faintly of bleach and something older, something that reminded me of mildew clinging to wet wood. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, stuttering every now and then in a way that made me look up instinctively, half expecting one of them to pop. I started with stocking shelves, pulling boxes out of the back, taping up the occasional spill. The monotony of it worked to calm me, but it didn't last. Not after midnight. That was when the first thing happened, the thing that made me realize this wasn't going to be like any job I'd ever had. It was 12:17 a.m., and I was restocking the cooler with sodas when the air went still, like someone had turned off every machine in the world at once. My ears popped with the silence. And then, just behind the glass, where the Cokes and Sprites lined up in neat little rows, I saw it. A face. Paws, not mine. The glass was cold against my arm, and I remember jerking back like I'd touched fire, but the face didn't move. Its features were smeared somehow, like a wet painting, but the eyes, oh God, the eyes were wide, bright, and wrong. They were staring at me, but they weren't blinking, not even when the fluorescent lights above flickered twice. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving only my reflection staring back at me with sweat prickling down my forehead. I told myself I was tired, that I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd dozed on my feet without realizing, but when I turned back to the stockroom door, I could have sworn I heard something shuffle inside, dragging its weight across the concrete. That was the first night, and it only got worse from there. By the third night, I'd started to notice patterns, like how the back corner near the pet food always felt colder, even when the AC wasn't running, or how the intercom sometimes clicked on by itself, buzzing faintly before going dead. There were voices too, faint ones, like whispers carried in from a distance, always just out of earshot, so you couldn't quite make out what they were saying. And then there were the customers, people who shouldn't have been there, because, officially, Dollar General closes at 10 p.m. But not this one. Not for me. At 1:03 in the morning, the bell above the door rang, and a woman stepped in wearing a floral dress that looked like it had been pulled from a thrift store decades ago. She didn't look at me, didn't speak, just walked straight to aisle 6, where the toys were, and stood there. I asked if she needed help, but she didn't move, didn't turn her head, didn't even breathe, from what I could see. I went back to the counter, pretending to ring something up just to give my hands something to do, but when I looked again, she was gone. Not gone like she'd walked out. I would have heard the bell. Gone like she'd never been there in the first place. That I wanted to quit right then. I thought about calling the manager, asking what the hell was going on, but when I pulled out the folded piece of paper he'd given me, something in me froze. Because for the first time since I'd taken it, I noticed the faintest smear of dried brown across the edge, like someone had handled it with blood on their fingers. My stomach churned, and I shoved it back into my pocket. Not tonight, I thought. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll ask. But tomorrow never came the way I expected. The shifts blurred together, nights stacking up until I lost count, the rules still sealed. Away in my pocket like a loaded gun, I was too afraid to fire. Things began to happen that I couldn't explain, like the sound of chains dragging in the ceiling above the office, or the flickering lights that sometimes spelled out letters on the floor if you looked at the shadows just right. I stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to rationalize. My brain kept circling back to one terrifying realization. Maybe this store wasn't meant to be here. Maybe it was a place that existed only at night, a place that borrowed the skin of a Dollar General to keep people like me inside. I think that's when the paranoia started sinking in. I started dreading the hours before my shift, dreading the way the sky turned dark, dreading the sound of the gravel crunching under my boots as I unlocked that back door. And yet I kept going back, paycheck after paycheck, because what else could I do? Every job in this town was dried up or already spoken for, and I couldn't leave Louisiana without money. I tried once, after my 5th shift, packed up my Chevy and drove east, but the road bent wrong, the miles repeating until I found myself back at that same cracked parking lot, headlights washing over the yellow facade. I didn't tell anyone about that. I couldn't. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. Pause. But that's when I knew. I wasn't just working a job. I was stuck here, and stuck people, they don't get choices. So I keep going. I keep stocking the shelves, ringing up customers who aren't really there, and pretending I don't see the figures moving in the frozen food aisle when I glance up at the security monitor. But the worst part, the part one can't escape now, is that folded paper still in my pocket, heavier with each passing night. Because last night, when the whispers came closer than they ever had, brushing against my ear like cold breath, I finally unfolded it. My hands shook as I read it. And what I found wasn't instructions, wasn't advice. It was a set of rules. Rules that were written for me. Rules that had already been broken. And if I'm right, if what I saw last night really happened, then I don't think I've got many nights left. You want to hear the rules, don't you? Because once you do, you'll understand why I can't quit. You'll understand why this Dollar General is wrong. And maybe you'll understand why I don't think I'm ever getting out. The nights blur together when you work the graveyard shift at a place that feels like it shouldn't exist, but I can tell you that by the time my 2nd week rolled around, I'd already begun to question whether I was losing my mind or if the store itself was working on me like some kind of parasite, feeding off my fear, reshaping my sense of reality until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. But one thing was certain. The rules, the ones still folded in my pocket, weren't just words on a page. They were warnings carved into my fate. Before I ever set foot behind that register, and I learned that lesson the hard way during the long hours of my early shifts when the little things started stacking up, scratching at my nerves until they couldn't be ignored. The first time I heard the sound, it was faint, like rats in the walls, a dry skittering shuffle that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise even as I tried to shake it off and tell myself it was just the building settling or the swamp outside, pushing its damp breath through the cracks. But the sound came again, sharper this time, like claws dragging along concrete, and it was coming from the stockroom where I'd left the light on, a pale yellow glow spilling out under the door like an invitation I didn't want to accept. I stood frozen in the aisle with a box of motor oil in my arms, staring at that thin line of light, and then the intercom crackled on, a burst of static followed by silence, and then whispering. Not words I could understand, but syllables. curling together like smoke, low and urgent, seeping out of the speakers above me. The sound surrounding me in the empty store until I dropped the box with a clatter and clutched the counter just to steady myself. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, leaving me in silence except for the steady hum of the fluorescent bulbs, which now seemed almost too loud, like they were straining to fill the void left by the whispers. I should have left right then. Should have turned in my key, locked the door behind me, and walked until my legs gave out if that's what it took to escape. But the strange thing about the store is that it keeps you tethered, tied to it like a dog on a chain. You can fight it, you can strain against it, but in the end, you're still stuck circling the same patch of dirt. I learned that again on my way home after that shift, when I tried to take a different road, one I'd driven plenty of times during the day, only to find the asphalt twisting back toward the same Dollar General like the whole town had rearranged itself in the dark to make sure I didn't stray too far. The second incident happened 3 nights later, and it still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it, because it wasn't just something I saw. It was something that saw me back. It was around 2:30 a.m., the hour when the air outside feels thick as tar and the frogs in the swamp go quiet like they're holding their breath. I was restocking canned goods, the mindless rhythm of it almost soothing, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a customer, which shouldn't have been possible since the doors were locked, but the bell above the entrance hadn't rung, and the alarm hadn't chimed, so I froze, peering down the aisle. Just as a figure slipped behind the shelves at the far end. My heart hammered in my chest, but I told myself it had to be my imagination, just a trick of the light on the metal cans, until I heard it. The sound of something brushing against the packages, like fingers trailing over them one by one. I called out, "Hello? We're closed." But the only answer was the faint clatter of a can rolling onto the linoleum floor. When I picked it up, my hand trembled because it wasn't dust that coated the can, but something darker, sticky, like dried blood. I dropped it and backed away, but when I glanced up toward the convex security mirror hanging in the corner, I saw it. Slow, tense tone, a face, pale and long, stretched too thin like the skin was being pulled tight over the skull, grinning, with teeth that were too sharp, too many, and its head was poking just far enough around the end of the shelf to lock eyes with me. My stomach twisted violently, but when I spun around to look directly, there was nothing there, just the empty aisle and the echo of my ragged breathing bouncing off the walls. That was the first night I started to wonder if the figures wanted me to see them, if they were testing how far they could push before I broke. And then came the customers. I stopped calling them that eventually, because calling them customers implies they were people, but at first, I didn't know any better. The bell would chime, soft and cheerful, and someone would walk in like it was the middle of the day, except their clothes never fit right, like they belonged to another decade, and they never spoke. They'd wander the aisles silently, some of them touching items like they'd forgotten what they were for, others just standing completely still until the lights flickered and they disappeared. The first time it happened, I tried to ring one of them up, a man in a gray suit who set a bottle of water on the counter. His hands were ice cold when he placed it down, so cold the condensation steamed against my skin, and when I tried to ask if he wanted a bag, he opened his mouth as if to answer, but nothing came out. No sound at all, just a cavernous silence that made the hum of the lights seem deafening. And when I blinked, just like that, he was gone. The bottle was still there, water sloshing inside. But the man, he had vanished into thin air. I didn't drink from that bottle, couldn't bring myself to, and when I checked the shelves later, it wasn't even a brand we carried. I threw it away, but the next night it was back on the counter waiting for me, the water level a little lower, as if someone, or something, had been drinking from it when I wasn't around. By the time the week ended, I was running on nerves. And caffeine, clutching the paper with the rules in my pocket like it was some kind of talisman. I didn't want to unfold it, didn't want to see what it said, because part of me was terrified it would make everything real, but the store was relentless. One night the stockroom door wouldn't open no matter how hard I pushed, even though it wasn't locked, and from inside I could hear a low, steady breathing, too heavy to belong to any person I knew. Another night, I turned on the security monitors in the office, only to see myself on the screen, except I wasn't moving. My double was standing completely still at the register, head tilted, eyes locked directly on the camera, even though I was in the back room at the time. When I stepped out to the counter, the figure was gone, but the screen still showed it standing there, staring with that same tilt of the head. I unplugged the monitor that night and refused to turn it back on, even when the manager asked why. The system was down. Speaking of the manager, the few times I saw him in the daylight, he didn't act like anything was wrong. He handed me my paycheck with that same hollow smile, asked if I was adjusting okay, and reminded me to read the paper when the time was right. His voice had this strange emphasis on the word time, like he wasn't talking about hours on a clock, but something heavier, something inevitable. I wanted to ask him what the hell was going on, why the store was like this at night, but every time I opened my mouth, the words shriveled on my tongue. It was like the store itself was keeping me quiet, reminding me that if I said too much, I'd regret it. One night, just after 3 a.m., I thought I heard someone crying in the bathroom. The sound was faint, muffled by the door, but it was unmistakable. Sobs, broken and raw, echoing against the tiles. My gut told me not to open it, but my feet carried me there anyway, because some part of me still wanted to believe that maybe there was a normal explanation, that maybe some desperate soul had wandered. In looking for shelter, I knocked softly and asked if they were okay. The crying stopped. Dead silence. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I pushed the door open anyway. The bathroom was empty, lights buzzing faintly, mirror fogged up as though someone had been breathing. Against it, and scrawled across the glass in dripping letters, was one word: look. My throat tightened, and against every instinct screaming inside me, I looked at the mirror. For a split second, I saw my reflection, but then the face shifted, features melting into something else entirely. The eyes widened too far, mouth stretching, open until it split the skin at the edges, and it whispered my name. My name. I stumbled back and slammed the door shut, heart pounding so hard I thought it would break my ribs, and I didn't open that bathroom again for weeks. By then, the rules had become more than just paper in my pocket. They were a weight, a presence, like they wanted me to read them before it was too late. Every time I reached for them, I felt the heat of dread in my chest, and still I resisted, because I knew in my bones that once I read them, I could never unknow what they said. But the store wasn't going to give me a choice forever. I could feel it closing in on me, each night worse than the last, the figures more brazen, the voices louder, the faces closer. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation, like the store was holding its breath, waiting for me to take that last step. And deep down, I started to understand something I hadn't wanted to admit. The rules weren't just there to keep me safe. They were there because the store wanted to play a game, and the only way to survive was to learn the rules before the game really began. I had been carrying that folded paper in my pocket for so long that it felt like part of me, like some second skin fused to the inside of my jeans, heavier than it should have been, heavier than a few ounces of ink and paper had any right to be. But after nights of seeing faces that shouldn't exist, after customers who weren't alive walked the aisles and whispered names they shouldn't know, after the bathroom mirror called me out like it was a living thing, I couldn't keep avoiding it, couldn't keep pretending ignorance was safer, because ignorance was just bait, and I knew deep in my gut that the store was going to force me one way or another, so I did it. I sat at the register at 3:14 in the morning, the hum of the fluorescents buzzing in my ears, and I unfolded the paper for the first time, my fingers trembling as though I already knew the weight of what I was about to see. And there it was, a list written in a strange, sharp handwriting that looked like it had been carved into the paper instead of written, the letters cutting so deep they almost bled through the other side. And at the top, in bold, underlined ink, were the words: "Rules for the night shift. Failure is final." My throat tightened, and I almost shoved it back into my pocket right then, but my eyes caught on the first line, and from that moment on, I couldn't stop reading, not even when I wanted to. Rule 1. Never let the front doors open after midnight. If the bell chimes and you see someone come in, don't greet them, don't speak, don't look at them directly. If you do, they'll notice you. If they notice you, they'll follow you home. Pause. Lower tone. My chest went cold reading that, because I thought back to the woman in the floral dress and the man with the bottle of water, and my stomach turned over when I realized I had already broken this rule without knowing it. I had spoken to them, tried to treat them like normal people, And even though they had disappeared inside the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe they hadn't really gone, that maybe they were just waiting. Rule 2. Don't answer. The intercom after 1 a.m. It isn't for you. That one made my skin crawl, because I remembered the static, the whispers curling through the speakers like smoke, and my hands shook so badly I had to put the paper down for a second before I could keep going. Rule 3. If you hear crying in the bathroom, do not go inside. Do not knock. Do not speak. If you acknowledge it, the crying will stop, but something else will come out. My breath caught at that, and I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my sleeve, because I had already broken that one too, already. Knocked, already looked in the mirror, already heard my name whispered back at me. My name. Rule 4. The security monitors don't show the store. They show what the store wants you to see. Never trust them. If you see yourself on the screen, unplug it immediately. That one hit me like a punch in the gut, because I had done exactly that. And I realized with dawning horror that maybe I had only survived because I hadn't waited long enough for whatever that double of me had wanted to do. Rule 5. Don't go into the stockroom after 2:30 a.m. You won't come back out. If you must, keep your eyes on the floor. Don't look at the shelves. Don't look at what's moving between them. The memory of claws dragging across concrete filled my ears, and I swore I could feel the vibration in my teeth, like something was reminding me I had heard it already, warning me too late. Rule 6. If the lights flicker 3 times in a row, stop whatever you're doing and stand completely still. Don't breathe loud. Don't move until they steady again. If you move, they'll notice. My hands went numb at that one, because I remembered the freezer, the face staring out at me, the lights flickering twice overhead, and I thought, what if they had flickered a 3rd time? What if I had moved? Rule 7. If you see a face in the freezer door that isn't your reflection, don't look away until it blinks. If you break eye contact, it will come closer. My vision swam reading that line, and for a moment I thought I might vomit, because I had looked away. I had looked away. Rule 8. Don't ever let yourself fall asleep in the store. If you wake up and the lights are off, it's already too late. That one chilled me to my bones, because I had come close, dozing off once with my head on the counter, only to jolt awake with the faint sensation that someone had been leaning over me, their cold breath brushing my ear. Rule 9. At exactly 3:33 a.m., you will hear knocking on the glass of the front door. Do not acknowledge it. Do not look up. If you see who's knocking, they'll come in. If they come in, you'll wish you hadn't been born. I read that one twice, my eyes scanning it over and over, because 3:33 wasn't far off, and the thought of someone, or something, waiting just outside the glass made my throat close in panic. Rule 10. When the sun starts to rise and you hear the birds, do not leave until you hear the bell chime one last time. That's the store letting you go. If you leave before, you won't really leave. You'll just carry it with you. My stomach dropped reading that, because suddenly, I remembered the morning I tried to drive east, remembered the road folding back, remembered the headlights catching the same cracked pavement of the parking lot, and I realized with mounting horror that maybe I had left too early that day. Maybe the store hadn't let me go. Maybe that was why I couldn't escape, that I sat there at the register with the paper trembling in my hands. Each rule carving itself deeper into my brain. Each one lining up with the horrors I had already seen, and it felt like someone had been watching me the entire time, tracking every mistake I'd made, every word I'd spoken, every glance I'd dared to take, and writing them down in advance as though I had never had a choice in the first place. My breath rattled in my chest, and I wanted to scream, wanted to run out the back door and never look back, but even then I knew it wouldn't matter. The store wouldn't let me go. Not now. Not after I had read the rules. When I finally folded the paper back up and shoved it into my pocket, my hands slick with sweat, the clock read 3:29 a.m., and my heart nearly stopped, because I remembered Rule 9, and I knew what was coming. My legs locked beneath me, my throat dry as sandpaper, as the minutes dragged out heavier than lead. And then, pause, slow, tense tone. At 3:33 on the dot, I heard it. 3 knocks. Sharp, deliberate, against the glass of the front door. I don't know if I lost consciousness for a second or an eternity, but when my eyes finally cracked open again, the storm had vanished. The fog had thinned to a chalky smear across the tree line, and the motel was quiet. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums until you swear you can hear your own blood. And as I staggered upright from the floor where I'd collapsed, my hands shaking, the clock on the lobby wall read 12:01 a.m., even though I knew damn well it should have been nearly 3. And the moment I saw those frozen red digits, I understood that the motel wasn't bound to normal time anymore, that I had stepped fully into whatever pocket reality this place existed in. Because when I looked outside the windows, the highway was gone. The asphalt, the yellow lines, the flicker of far-off truck headlights, all gone, replaced with a vast, black expanse of nothing. Not even stars, like the motel had been plucked from earth and set adrift into void. And as panic spread like fire in my chest, the intercom crackled again, the same dry voice I'd heard before whispering rule number 5. If the highway disappears, you must keep all the room doors locked. Do not under any circumstance open them until sunrise. But before I could even process those words, I heard the first knock, sharp, deliberate, at room 6, and my body locked rigid, the sound echoing down the hollow hallways. Too human, too perfectly timed, and I thought of the shadow. With the lamp, the figures at the glass, the screaming in the vents, and I knew this was another test. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was pounding, rattling the walls like a battering ram. And then I heard something that made my blood run to ice. My own voice, perfectly mimicked, calling from behind the door of room 6, screaming, begging, "Please, it's me. Let me out. You locked me in. Don't leave me here." And I swear every instinct I had was at war, one side clawing at me to open that door, to free the thing that sounded like me, and the other side screaming that if I touched that handle, I'd be dragging something into this world that had no right to exist. So I forced myself back into the lobby, teeth clenched, fists balled, heart pounding like a drumline. But the mimic didn't stop. It only grew more desperate, shouting all the memories of my life, my mother's name, my first job, the way I cried the night my dad died. All of it hurled at me through a locked motel door in my own voice until I nearly broke. And then silence, total silence, before the sound of a key scratching into a lock that shouldn't have been turning. And that's when I realized it wasn't the room's door being unlocked. It was the lobby's front door, the one that opened to the void. And with my whole body shaking, I threw myself at it, forcing the deadbolt back in place just as the handle twisted violently in my grip. Something on the other side pushing, testing, scraping long nails across the wood, and in that instant, every shadow in the lobby lengthened, stretched like rubber across the walls, forming shapes with too many limbs, watching me. And I realized that maybe they weren't just trying to get in. The motel itself was trying to get me to let them, that this place was designed to wear me down until I cracked, until I willingly opened something I shouldn't. And as the pressure on the door ceased, I collapsed against it, sweating, shaking, eyes darting to the clock, and I nearly sobbed when I saw the numbers ticking again, 3:15 a.m., as if time had rebooted itself. But then the overhead lights all flickered once, twice, and went out, drowning me in blackness. And when the emergency exit signs glowed faint red, I saw him again, the lamp shadow, standing at the end of the hall, his head tilted, the glow inside his lantern body pulsing brighter, each throb in sync with my own heartbeat, like he was tethered to me somehow, feeding from me. And though my body screamed to look away, I couldn't, not until his arm, long, spindly, wrong, lifted slowly and pointed toward the manager's office door, the one I had sworn never to open, the one that had been locked since the first night. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The rules weren't meant to protect me. They were meant to delay me, to keep me alive just long enough until the motel itself decided it was ready for me. And with my legs trembling, my breath shallow, I stepped toward that office, because something deep inside told me I wasn't surviving the night unless I did exactly what he wanted. I thought the nightmare couldn't deepen any further after what I had just endured, but I was wrong, because stepping into that next shift felt like stepping into my own grave while still alive. The rules gnawed at my thoughts with sharp insistence, replaying like a mantra carved into my skull. and no matter how much I wanted to walk away, to drive out of that desolate parking lot and never look back, something unseen gripped me in place, something that whispered every time I touched the handle of my car that leaving was a death worse than staying. And so I walked back into that motel, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they were mocking me, the lobby filled with the faint smell of mildew and smoke, and the desk bell gleamed like an eye, daring me to hit it, though I didn't, because I knew better now. I had learned my lesson. The wrong sound in this place invited attention, and attention here was fatal. I sat at the desk, hands trembling, scanning the cracked wallpaper, the shadows that shifted too much on the walls, the faint hum of something behind them that didn't sound like pipes or electricity, but rather like breathing, enormous lungs, drawing in air through miles of plaster. And I felt my stomach churn as I realized I wasn't alone, hadn't been alone since I took this job, and likely never would be alone again. Because this place clung, it burrowed into you like a tick. It made you part of its ecosystem, whether you wanted to or not. My shift began as usual with the flickering sign outside that buzzed on its own rhythm. But this time it felt almost like a signal, as though someone, or something, was being beckoned by the faltering neon, and sure enough, a car pulled in. A rusted old Buick that wheezed to a stop, and out stepped a man with sunken eyes and skin so pale it almost reflected the dim lights. He didn't speak when he entered, didn't look at me, just slid an envelope across the counter, and when I opened it, I nearly vomited, because inside weren't papers or cash, but a collection of fingernails, human nails, yellowed and cracked, some with dried blood at the edges. And beneath them a note written in jagged letters. Room 6 must remain occupied, no matter the cost. And my heart seized because I knew Room 6 was supposed to stay locked. That was one of the rules, and yet here I was holding a demand that seemed to override the rules entirely, and I couldn't tell if it was a test, a trap, or the beginning of something worse, but the man was already gone, vanished through the door before I could even raise my head. And when I stepped out to the lot, his Buick wasn't there. No tracks in the gravel, nothing but silence and the fog curling closer around the edges of the lot, as though the world outside the motel was dissolving into nothingness. Shaking, I took the envelope to the office safe. The one rule said to never open the safe, never under any circumstance. But when I placed the envelope against its surface, the lock clicked on its own and the safe door creaked open just enough to swallow the envelope whole before sealing shut again. And I nearly screamed because I hadn't touched it, hadn't even thought about opening it. Yet it had responded like it was alive, like it was hungry, and I wondered if that safe was less of a container and more of a mouth, feeding off whatever tributes were brought to it. Trying to steady my breathing, I returned to the desk, but the air felt heavier, like I was submerged in invisible water, and as the clock struck midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple footsteps above me, but there was no second floor. I knew this building by now. It was one story, all rooms on ground level, yet the ceiling creaked as though an army was marching above me, and the chandelier shook, dust falling in tiny streams onto the counter, and I remembered another of the rules. If you hear footsteps overhead, do not look up and do not acknowledge them. So I sat there, staring at my hands, clenching them into fists, the sound continuing for what felt like an hour until finally, mercifully, it stopped. Though in that silence I swore I heard whispering. Not from above, but from inside me, inside my bones, voices urging me to break the rules, to go into room 6, to look at the ceiling, to open the safe again. They wanted me to fail. They wanted me consumed. And I knew then that the rules weren't just guidelines. They were bait. The motel wanted me to test them, to break them, so it could feed. Around 2 a.m., a guest checked in, though I didn't see them arrive. One moment the lobby was empty. The next, a woman in a red dress was at the counter, her skin waxy, her smile stretched too wide. She didn't ask for a key, didn't say her name. She just said in a voice that made my ears bleed, "It's almost time for room 6." And then she drifted away toward the hallway, her feet not touching the ground, her dress dragging like it was soaked in something dark. And I felt the overwhelming urge to follow her, but forced myself to remain rooted because I knew if I left the desk, if I pursued her, the motel would have me. It was waiting for that slip, but I couldn't ignore the sound of a door unlocking on its own, the echo of hinges groaning open, and the unmistakable slam of room 6 closing behind her. My blood went cold because now room 6 was occupied, against the rules, against all reason, and yet I had let it happen by doing nothing, and the motel seemed to laugh through the groaning pipes, a sound like amusement rattling through the walls. The hours dragged, and I sat there watching shadows flicker across the walls, each one shaped like something different, some human, some not. And I realized they weren't shadows at all but imprints, echoes of the people who had come here. Before me, people who had failed, their outlines etched into the motel's memory, and I understood with crushing horror that if I broke the rules, if I joined them, I too would become one of those flickers, doomed to repeat my fear forever. By 4 a.m., the lights began to flicker violently, plunging the lobby into bursts of darkness, and in one of those blackouts I felt something brush against my neck, icy and sharp, and a voice whispered directly into my ear, "Open the safe, let us out." And I knew then that the safe didn't just take tributes, it stored things alive and waiting, and the motel was wearing me down shift by shift, gnawing at my resolve. And the worst part was, I could feel it working, feel my will breaking, because deep down, some part of me wanted to know what was inside, wanted to see what the motel kept hidden, even if it meant my own destruction, and that terrified me more than anything else, because the motel was becoming part of me, and I was becoming part of it. I should have known it was going to end this way, that all the warnings and the rules weren't there to protect me, but to remind me of the inevitable, like mile markers counting down to a cliff's edge that you can't stop yourself from driving off. And as I staggered back through the endless hallways of the motel, blood still dripping from my hand where the door had bitten me and my mind unraveling with every flicker of the humming overhead lights, I realized that Chapter 5 hadn't been a victory at all, but only a reprieve, a false dawn before the eternal night. Because when I pushed open the office door and expected to find the dusty desk and the ledger of rules sitting there like always, the room had changed, the walls breathing faintly like the ribs of some enormous buried beast. And on the desk sat not the ledger but the keyring, and every key glowed red hot, as if pulled straight from a furnace. And I heard the clerk's voice from somewhere beyond the walls, slow and drowning in distortion like a record dragged through tar, telling me I had broken them all, every single one, that the moment I read the first rule I had agreed to a contract I didn't understand, that the motel wasn't a place to stay but a place to consume, a maw that needed fresh memories, fresh fear, fresh lives, and I was only the latest fool to wander in thinking I could survive the night. But the rules had never been survival instructions. They were bait. A game laid out so that I would cling to them like scripture, and in the clinging become entangled, until even my refusal, my rebellion, my attempts to burn them or break them, only pulled me deeper into the binding, and I wanted to scream at him, to demand why, but the words stuck because the walls had mouths now, black wet grins opening where the wallpaper peeled, and they were mouthing back everything I'd said, everything I'd done, replaying my whole stay in this nightmare in. And then the desk drawer rattled open, and inside wasn't paperwork, but a mirror. Not a clean mirror, but one coated in a dark sheen. And when I leaned close, I didn't see myself anymore, but the clerk. His skin pale and cracked like old parchment, his teeth sharpened into splinters, his eyes voids filled with shifting static. And he said, "The last rule is the only one that matters. You never leave." And then I realized why I hadn't seen any other guests. Why the logbook of names had been empty yet the rooms were never truly vacant. Because every guest who failed the rules wasn't allowed to check out, but was absorbed. Absorbed into the building, into the fixtures, into the shadows, their voices becoming whispers in the vents, their bodies stretched thin as wallpaper, their memories stuffed into the creaking floorboards, and the longer you stayed, the closer the motel pulled you into itself. Until even time became an infection, looping and spiraling, which was why I kept feeling like I'd done this before, like I'd already walked this corridor, already touched this handle, because I had, because I was, because the motel didn't. Let stories end. It just replays them over and over with new actors until the actors realize they were never new at all. just echoes of the same lost soul. And my knees buckled and I fell, but instead of hitting the carpet, I crashed into water, cold, black, endless water, swallowing me whole. And above me floated the neon vacancy sign, glowing red even as it sank. And shapes swam just below the surface, the other guests, their faces warped, their eyes hollow, their mouths gaping with screams that couldn't break the surface tension. And they reached for me, their fingers tangling in my clothes, pulling me deeper, pulling me into the dark where the motel waited, because the motel wasn't just a building on some forgotten road. It was a mouth in reality itself, chewing on years, chewing on souls, chewing on the fragile belief that rules can save you. And as the blackness rushed into my lungs, as the walls of water collapsed, and I felt myself stretch thin, paper thin, thinner, until I was no longer flesh but plaster, no longer thought but echo, I realized the final doomed truth. I wasn't the last guest. I never had been, because there is no last guest, only the next. And when they arrive, trembling and desperate, they'll find the rules on the desk, scratched into yellowed paper in handwriting eerily similar to mine, and they'll think it's a warning, when in truth it's just another trap, another cycle, and the voice whispering to them from the vents, urging them to follow, to beware, to obey, will be mine, because I am the motel now, and the motel is me, and we are forever hungry.